welcome to the Rockin Eighties party. This is a decade of modernization, neon colors, and the all-too-famous Michael Jackson. All this food you see here was popular in the 80s, and everyone started to deliver pizza in the 80s, which is why we have it. So get up, get some food, get excited, and have some fun.
We're going to start off with pop culture and trends, fashion trends especially. We're each just going to explain our outfit. I'm like the 80s prep, and I wear like a polo or an Izod was popular, and a collared shirt and skinny jeans. Rolled up especially were a big thing. And Sperry's, they were usually dark brown in that time, but I didn't have dark brown. And then Kelly?
I am like the pop kind of girl. We wore leggings. They wore leg warmers. I don't have leg warmers, could not find them. It's like spring. But they wore those mini skirts. They wore oversized sweatshirts with the shoulders cut out, or the neck cut out so the shoulders hang over, big hair, vivid makeup, and bows in their hair.
Okay, and I'm the epitome of big hair today, and I dress more like what someone who liked rock would dress as. Denim on denim was huge for people who didn't like Michael Jackson. They didn't like the whole leather jacket thing. Concert shirts were big. Baby doll socks, that's what I'm wearing, they were big. Heels that sort of coordinated with your outfit, and I have a red purse too, were big, just like matching. And thin belts were big, as well as skinny jeans rolled up like Linsey said.
And I am not the epitome of what you see on the screen, but the business, or the suit, is because, as I'll talk about later, the computer became really the personal computer in about 85, 86 with Apple's invention. So a business person would have had an easier job to do business.
Alright, and then the fads during this time were MTV, which was really big. It was basically a movie, or a music video show, and all they had was music and music news, and they were a big deal in the 80s. And then our next fad was the Pepsi Challenge, and during this time there was a big war between Coke and Pepsi. So Samantha,
all right. For the Pepsi Challenge, basically it was a huge ad campaign for Pepsi. So needless to say, Pepsi was always going to be the winner. What happened was, across the United States, there was booths set up because the whole thing was take the Pepsi Challenge. And my dad was telling me that he was lucky enough to take the Pepsi Challenge, and he swears that the Coke, or the leading brand of soda that was competing with Pepsi, which usually was Coke, was actually made flat, so that Pepsi would win by default. So now, what we're going to do, so all of you be quiet, don't exchange information, and take a sip of one of each, and see which one you think is Pepsi, and see which one you think is Coke.
Coke.
Pepsi.
I agree.
Coke
All right,
and Pepsi.
you two are correct, and actually those are the same.
No, wait. Is it Coke though? Is it Coke? Okay.
They're both.
Looks like
They're both Coke. You're lying.
I win. What's my prize?
Congratulations.
Thank you all, and you can have your treat.
Put it on purpose.
Yes.
Yes, we
And
did.
we personally picked on you because we like you. Sometimes.
I guess that makes you feel better.
And that's the Pepsi Challenge.
Actually mix these, you guys.
Okay.
Our film of this decade is Back to the Future, which came out in '85. And it blends science fiction, fantasy, and comedy. And it's basically about this boy who is from the 80s, and he accidentally travels back to the 50s in a time machine. And it shows a big contrast between the styles of the 50s and the styles of the 80s. And I'm sure through the Decades Project you could see the way the 50s people dress and the way we dress is completely different. But it did a really good job of showing the language and the music and the outfits of the 80s. And people had just started to get cable during this time, and Back to the Future was always on, so you could watch it all the time. And how many of you have ever said the quote, "So why don't you make like a tree and leave"? Everyone's heard that?
Heard it. Heard it.
Okay, we've never heard that ever. Well, in this movie, Biff Tannen, he actually says, so why don't you make up a tree and get out of here? He says it wrong, it's supposed to be funny or whatever, but we still use that origin of the quote today.
Okay. The next thing is our scandal, which was the Tylenol tampering incident. And in October of 1982, some unknown suspects tampered with over 150,000 Tylenol bottles and put cyanide in each one. And it killed 7 people in Chicago, which was a big deal. And the effects afterwards were that Tylenol's market, they were a 37% rating over their market, which, you know, in painkillers or whatever, and it went down to 7% afterwards, after the scandal. And also, due to the scandal, we have those little, like popping lids on pills and Cokes, and anything you buy basically has a lid or some type of seal. And if we hadn't, if this scandal hadn't have happened, we probably wouldn't have those seals today.
Okay, the major disaster in the 80s was definitely the Challenger explosion. 7 people were killed in this, and I'll read you the, Francis Scobie was the spacecraft commander, Michael Smith was the pilot, and then there were 3 mission specialists aboard, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onzuka. And then Gregory Jarvis was the payload specialist, and Sharon McCaufel was the first teacher to ever fly in space. So as you can tell, that the people aboard the Challenger represented the variety of American cultures, race, gender, religion, geography, like from where they were from. And so it was a really big deal. Back then, everyone knew when something was going into space. Everyone knew that the Challenger was going to go. Today, stuff goes off all the time. We have no idea what's going on. But back then, it was a big deal. So when it exploded, billions of people saw it on TV. Like, everyone was shocked. You can imagine 9/11, how much that affected us. It was greater than that. So I can't even imagine how big of a deal it was.
And our invention, like I said earlier, was the Macintosh 2. And the reason I chose that is, again, because before Apple came out with some of the developments on this computer, you see the mouse, one of the first few mice that was actually used on a personal computer. And right now, we probably would not have that if it weren't for Apple, because back then it was very difficult to write programs and even do something simple like type a letter that we take for granted today, because everything was was coded in computer code. And Apple also came out with something called the GUI, Graphical User Interface, which means you can actually see everything instead of having to type it out and remember. Just like we use today, we click the start menu or we click an icon, and that's what Apple came out with. And so it made business a lot easier and made some developments with Apple in the computer industry. And literature is our next one. For the most influential author, I chose Stephen King because when he was young still, or when he had graduated high school, he went to grammar school and really loved short stories and publishing very fanciful and very unreal fictional stories. So he graduated grammar school with a degree and took a few years teaching at a high school, and then he spent some time in England. And around that time, in the early 80s or early 70s, that was when England's style of abstract, which is the style, the abstract style came out in England. So Stephen King was one of the major authors to bring it into America, and he did so with, like I said, several of his shorter stories and shorter novels, and with the most influential novel, which was his book It. And if you've seen the movie, it's creepy and weird, and nothing like that could really ever happen. So, like I said, that's one of the things of the abstract style. And Stephen King just had the knack for being able to create things that were so unreal that people were intrigued. And so books for leisure people actually wanted to read now because it was fun and weird to read this and figure out what was going on. It wasn't just like every other occurrence. And so just a few things about the abstract style.